Birthdays are supposed to be moments of joy. They're supposed to be times when family and friends come together, eat too much food, laugh too loudly, and stay up a little later than usual. For Michael and his family, this was exactly the plan. After a long, stressful year, he was finally turning 40, and his wife had worked hard to plan a simple backyard gathering. Nothing extravagant. Just some decorations, a rented grill, a few tables set up under strings of lights, and about 20 friends and relatives ready to celebrate. But in their quiet suburban neighborhood, one person saw things differently. Her name was Karen, and she lived 3 houses down. Everyone in the neighborhood was familiar with her reputation. She was the type who measured grass with a ruler, who called the HOA over a mailbox that didn't meet community standards, and who left angry notes on windshields if a car was parked on the street for longer than a few hours. She thrived on confrontation, and over the years many residents had simply learned to avoid her. That Saturday evening, as the first guests arrived at Michael's house, laughter and music began filling the air. It wasn't loud, just a Bluetooth speaker on the patio, but to Karen, it was the beginning of what she would call an unacceptable disruption. She stood at her window, arms crossed, staring at the glowing lights across the street as if they were a personal attack. Each laugh, each burst of cheer seemed to fuel her irritation further. By the time Michael was blowing out the candles on his cake, Karen had made up her mind. She would not tolerate this. She believed the neighborhood had rules about noise, even though the HOA handbook clearly allowed backyard gatherings until 11 p.m. But Karen didn't care about rules. She cared about control. At first, she stormed into her driveway, phone in hand, recording the party from a distance. Guests noticed her immediately, muttering under their breath about her boldness. She filmed the decorations, the tables, even the children running around with sparklers, narrating to herself about violations and disturbances. Michael's wife tried to ignore her, but several guests whispered that they should probably expect trouble, and trouble arrived quickly. By 9 o'clock, as the food was being cleared and more laughter echoed from the backyard, red and blue lights suddenly illuminated the street. A patrol car pulled up right in front of Michael's house. The music stopped instantly. Conversations died out. Everyone looked around, confused, as the officers stepped out of the vehicle. Karen, standing at the edge of her driveway, smirked triumphantly. She had called the cops, claiming that there was an out-of-control party, that the noise was unbearable, and even that she suspected underage drinking. To her, this was the final blow. The moment she could humiliate her neighbor publicly and establish herself once again as the enforcer of order. The officers approached, scanning the backyard where children were still eating cake and adults were tidying up plates. There was no chaos, no wild drinking, no noise beyond the sound of normal conversation. It was painfully obvious that the situation had been exaggerated. Still, the officers had to do their job. They asked a few questions, checked to ensure there were no problems, and quickly realized this was nothing more than a petty neighbor dispute. At that moment, most people would have accepted the result and gone back inside. But Karen was not. Like most people, she marched over to the officers, demanding that they shut the party down completely. She insisted the music was deafening, that the crowd was rowdy, and even accused Michael of operating an illegal event without permits. Her tone grew sharper, her gestures wilder, as she tried to spin an innocent birthday into a criminal act. The officers exchanged glances. The guests, still standing quietly, watched the spectacle unfold. Michael, embarrassed but calm, assured the officers that everything was under control. The officers nodded, clearly unconvinced by Karen's outlandish claims, but Karen didn't stop. She followed the officers back to their patrol car, raising her voice, pointing at Michael's home, accusing him of disturbing the peace and breaking community laws that didn't even exist. When the officers tried to calm her down, she grew louder. When they asked her to step back, she stepped closer. What began as a simple noise complaint was quickly spiraling into something else entirely. The guests were now whispering among themselves, phones discreetly out, recording Karen's meltdown. She didn't notice, or maybe she didn't care, that half the party now had cameras pointed at her. In her mind, she was the hero of the story, bravely standing up for the neighborhood against this lawless party. But in reality, she was painting herself into a corner. The officers warned her once to lower her voice. She ignored them. They warned her again to stop interrupting. She waved them off, claiming she had rights and that she would not be silenced. Each step she took closer to them seemed to push her luck further. And then, in a split second, everything changed. Karen tried to grab one of the officers' notepads, insisting she needed to write the violation herself. The officer pulled back, but Karen persisted, reaching toward his uniform. That was the breaking point. What had started as a noise complaint was now escalating into obstruction, disorderly conduct, and possible assault on an officer. The guests gasped as one officer stepped forward, firmly telling her to stop. She shouted louder, drawing the attention of even more neighbors who were now peeking out of their windows and standing on lawns. The entire street had become an audience, and then the unthinkable happened. The officers placed Karen under arrest. Gasps echoed from the crowd as Karen's triumphant smirk dissolved into shock. She resisted at first, shouting about injustice and corruption. But the officers calmly handcuffed her and walked her toward the patrol car. Guests at the party couldn't believe their eyes. Phones captured every moment. Neighbors, who had suffered years of Karen's meddling, watched with quiet satisfaction. For Michael and his family, the birthday party had taken a surreal turn. What was supposed to be a quiet celebration was now the scene of the neighborhood's most infamous meltdown. But as Karen was placed in the back of the squad car, the story was far from over. Because if there's one thing about people like Karen, it's that they don't go down quietly. And as the patrol car pulled away, leaving behind stunned silence and whispers of disbelief, everyone knew the drama was only beginning. The night after Karen's arrest lingered in everyone's memory, like a dream. Guests replayed the footage on their phones, neighbors whispered across fences, and the quiet suburban street buzzed with gossip. Michael's birthday party was no longer just a family event. It had turned into the defining moment of the neighborhood's history. By morning, videos had already started circulating online. What began as a few shaky recordings shared in group chats spread quickly to social media. Karen's voice, shrill and defiant, could be heard in clip after clip, insisting she had rights as she jabbed her finger toward the officers. The sight of her being handcuffed, her indignant protests echoing into the night, was replayed with captions, jokes, and comments. Within hours, she was no longer just a neighborhood nuisance. She was viral. But while neighbors chuckled and rewatched the clips with satisfaction, Karen was stewing. After being released from custody later that night, she stormed home with a renewed sense of vengeance. She believed she had been wronged, humiliated, and set up by Michael's family. Instead of seeing her own actions as the cause, she convinced herself she had been the victim of an orchestrated attack. The following morning, she wasted no time. At dawn, she marched across the street and plastered handwritten notices on mailboxes, warning residents that the neighborhood had been overrun by criminals. She claimed Michael's party had endangered children, violated noise ordinances, and attracted police attention because of their lawless behavior. Each letter was a rambling mix of accusations and half-truths, designed to paint herself as the hero who had tried to save the community. But her plan backfired immediately. Neighbors, many of whom had seen the arrest firsthand, were appalled. Instead of rallying behind her, they quietly united against her. In private conversations, they admitted they were tired of her constant meddling, tired of the endless complaints about lawns, trash bins, mailboxes, and now birthday parties. For years, people had tolerated her behavior, hoping she would calm down. But this latest stunt proved she was out of control. Michael, meanwhile, tried to move on. He didn't want to escalate the situation further. The party had ended. The videos had gone viral, and as far as he was concerned, it was over. But Karen wasn't finished. She filed an official complaint with the HOA, demanding that Michael's family be fined for disturbing the peace. She accused him of holding an unauthorized event, bringing too many guests, and inviting criminal activity into the neighborhood. The HOA board, weary of Karen's constant filings, reluctantly agreed to review the complaint. But when they gathered for the monthly meeting, it quickly became clear how absurd the situation had become. Dozens of neighbors attended, many bringing their own video clips of Karen's arrest as evidence of what really happened. What was supposed to be a routine HOA meeting turned into a packed room of angry residents demanding that something be done about Karen instead. The board tried to remain neutral, but the pressure was undeniable. For years, Karen had been the loudest voice in the room, always pushing for stricter rules and heavier fines. But now, for the first time, the community itself was pushing back. One by one, neighbors stood and shared stories of her harassment, letters shoved under doors, threats of fines, and late-night confrontations over trivial matters. It became clear this wasn't just about one birthday party, it was about years of unchecked behavior. Karen, of course, sat in the front row, arms folded, glaring at anyone who dared speak against her. She scribbled notes furiously, ready to counter every word. But as testimonies piled up, her face grew redder. She wasn't the hero she thought she was. She was the problem, and everyone knew it. By the end of the meeting, the board announced they would be reviewing Karen's conduct. In light of the mounting complaints, it was a small victory, but it sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. For the first time, the power Karen wielded through intimidation and constant HOA filings seemed to be slipping away. Yet Karen wasn't done. She doubled down, convinced. The neighborhood was conspiring against her. She began pacing the sidewalks with her phone out, recording children playing, dogs barking, and even cars driving by. She muttered about evidence and proof, but neighbors grew increasingly uncomfortable. Parents warned their kids to stay away from her. People began documenting her behavior themselves, building their own archive of evidence. The tension reached a breaking point 2 weeks later. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, Karen marched to Michael's driveway with a clipboard in hand, Ratios, claimed she was conducting an inspection for the HOA, and demanded access to his backyard to verify that the party decorations had been taken down. Michael, stunned, refused to engage, reminding her she had no authority to enter his property. Karen, however, wouldn't leave. She paced the sidewalk, shouting accusations for all to hear. Neighbors came outside, watching the spectacle unfold. Once again, phones were raised, recording every second. Karen seemed oblivious to the fact that she was being documented yet again. Her voice grew shrill as she accused Michael of breaking laws that didn't exist. She insisted she had files on him and threatened to call the police once more, and she did. Within minutes, another patrol car arrived, officers stepping out with weary expressions. They had been here before, and they knew what to expect. Karen launched into her tirade about Michael's supposed illegal activities, but this time the officers didn't even bother walking into the backyard. They already knew the truth. Instead, they turned their attention to Karen herself. The neighbors held their breath. Michael's family watched silently from their porch. Karen's face twisted in frustration as the officers began questioning her instead of Michael. They reminded her that filing false reports was a serious offense, that her behavior had been disruptive not just to Michael's family, but to the entire neighborhood. For a moment, it seemed she might finally back down. But then, in true Karen fashion, she escalated again, raising her voice, stepping too close, insisting that she had authority she didn't possess. And once again, she crossed the line. The officers warned her. She ignored them. She tried to push past them toward Michael's property. And just like before, the cuffs came out. The neighborhood erupted in whispers and stunned laughter. For the second time in just a few weeks, Karen was arrested in front of everyone. The sight was both shocking and oddly satisfying. This wasn't just a single mistake anymore. This was a pattern, and the consequences were catching up to her. As the patrol car pulled away for the second time, neighbors gathered on sidewalks, shaking their heads. Some laughed. Others simply sighed in relief. For Michael and his family, it was clear now, this wasn't going to end quietly. Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She was spiraling, and no one knew what she would do next. The story wasn't over. If anything, it was just heating up. Karen's second arrest shook the neighborhood in a way that no amount of gossip or angry HOA meetings ever could. By now, everyone knew her antics weren't just annoying, they were dangerous. 2 arrests in less than a month had painted a clear picture, and neighbors began openly discussing what they had whispered about for years. Karen was out of control, and something had to be done before it escalated even further. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting just days after her second arrest. Unlike past gatherings where Karen had dominated the room with her endless complaints, this time the turnout was unprecedented. Nearly every homeowner attended, many carrying copies of police reports, written statements, and video clips saved from their phones. People who had once been silent finally spoke up. Parents talked about their kids being harassed. Pet owners shared stories about Karen threatening to call animal control over harmless barking. Homeowners described being fined repeatedly for infractions that never existed. The room buzzed with frustration, but beneath it all was a shared sense of unity. For years, Karen had divided the community, pitting neighbor against neighbor with her constant tattling and filings. Now, ironically, her own behavior had united everyone against her. The board listened carefully, acknowledging the growing pile of complaints. They had tolerated her for too long, but her arrests forced them to confront the reality that she wasn't just a difficult resident, she was a liability. While the HOA considered its options, Karen herself was doubling down spectacularly. She returned from her second brush with the law angrier than ever. She claimed she was being persecuted and launched a barrage of emails, accusing the board of conspiring against her. She sent letters to city officials, insisting that Michael's family was running illegal events. She even threatened lawsuits against neighbors who had posted the viral videos of her arrests. But if Karen thought intimidation would save her, she underestimated just how fed up the neighborhood had become. Residents forwarded her emails to the HOA and the police. Parents began documenting her behavior more thoroughly, creating a paper trail of her harassment. One neighbor even compiled a folder containing every baseless complaint Karen had filed over the past 5 years, dozens of petty grievances that revealed a clear pattern. The breaking point came 3 weeks later. One quiet afternoon, Karen stormed into another neighbor's yard uninvited, claiming their garden hose was draining onto her property. She shouted so loudly that the entire cul-de-sac heard her. But this time, instead of shrinking away, Neighbors came outside in force, phones recorded from every angle. The homeowner calmly explained she was trespassing, and when she refused to leave, the police were called for a third time. When the officers arrived, they already knew the story. They'd been here before, and they weren't interested in hearing another one of her tirades. The arrest was swift, decisive, and this time far more serious. Karen wasn't just charged with disorderly conduct, she was also facing trespassing charges. The weight of her repeated behavior was finally catching up with her in a legal sense. By the end of the week, word spread quickly. Karen had been ordered to appear in court, and the entire neighborhood seemed eager to see what would happen next. The courtroom was small, but the case drew a surprising audience. Neighbors showed up to testify. HOA members came prepared with documentation, and even Michael attended, ready to put an end to the nightmare that had started on his birthday. The judge listened carefully as witness after witness recounted their experiences. The viral videos were played on screen, showing Karen's meltdowns in painful detail. Every protest she had made, every exaggerated claim, every outburst was now preserved as undeniable evidence. Karen, standing at the defendant's table, tried to argue that she was being targeted. She claimed the videos were edited, that the neighbors had conspired against her, and that she was the victim of harassment. But the sheer volume of testimony made her words hollow. The judge wasn't convinced. Neither was anyone else in the room. In the end, the ruling was clear. Karen was found guilty of multiple charges, including disorderly conduct and trespassing. She was fined heavily, ordered to complete community service, and placed on probation. But perhaps most importantly, the judge issued a restraining order, legally preventing her from harassing Michael's family or any of her neighbors ever again. The HOA didn't waste time. With the court ruling in hand and the mountain of complaints against her, the board voted to strip Karen of her position on the compliance committee and formally censured her behavior. It was the first time in the neighborhood's history that such action had been taken against a resident. For many, it felt like a long overdue victory. The change in the community was immediate. The tension that had hung in the air for years seemed to lift overnight. Neighbors who had once avoided each other for fear of being reported began chatting again across driveways. Children played outside without parents worrying about angry confrontations. Even the HOA meetings took on a new tone, calmer, more cooperative, no longer dominated by one voice of negativity. As for Michael and his family, life slowly returned to normal. His backyard, once the site of Karen's false accusations, became a place of laughter again. Friends felt comfortable visiting. Parties resumed, though always modest, always within reason. And though the memory of Karen's antics lingered, it was no longer a source of stress. Instead, it became a story, a wild, unbelievable tale about the neighbor who called the cops on a birthday party, only to end up in handcuffs herself. Karen, meanwhile, grew quieter. She still lived in the neighborhood, but the restraining order and her probation forced her to keep her distance. Where once she had strutted around with a phone in hand, looking for violations, she now kept to herself. The same neighbors who once feared her now regarded her with indifference. She had lost the power she once thrived on, not because anyone fought her directly, but because her own behavior had destroyed her credibility. The irony was impossible to ignore. Karen had tried to humiliate Michael's family, to break up a simple birthday party with police intervention. She had wanted to be the enforcer, the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood. Instead, she had exposed herself as the very problem. She claimed to be fighting, and so the neighborhood moved forward, freer and lighter without her constant interference. The story of her downfall became a kind of local legend, told at block parties and whispered to new residents as a cautionary tale. Because in the end, what started as a birthday celebration turned into something much bigger, a turning point for an entire community. And it all began with one call, one complaint, and one neighbor who took things too far.